Thanks to Mark for having me on a kind of gloomy Friday evening. My name is Steve Wiegenstein. I'm the author of 3 historical novels and a collection of short stories. This is the short story collection, which is the most recent publication. I grew up in the Missouri Ozarks. My family were from a community north of Fredericktown, and they've been there since the 1840s. They're long time residents, and I have always been kind of interested in writing about the Ozarks, although I have to say I'm not sure that the Ozarks are as distinctive and unique a place as they are in a lot of people's minds. For me anyway, a lot of the issues in the Ozarks are essentially rural issues, and they can be replicated all over the country. So I think of myself as a writer more on rural topics rather than on specifically Ozark topics. In fact, this book was used in a class for the Ozarks Studies major down at Missouri State University in Springfield. And the professor told me that his students complained because said that the characters in it were too normal. That they didn't fit the kind of hillbilly stereotypes that they were expecting that you see on television. Things like that. The stories have been building up for years and years. I've been publishing them in small magazines, and they were just finally collected in 2020, right at the end of 2020, by a company called Corner Post Press, which is based in West Plains. And if anyone would like to buy a copy, I'll be happy to sign a copy for you before you leave. It was a very distinct honor to work with Corner Post Press. They did a wonderful job on this collection. And much to our amazement, the book was selected as a finalist for the 2021 Penn Faulkner Award in fiction. Kind of came out of the blue for all of us, and we were just delighted and somewhat taken aback by the thing. It's like, wow, really, these stories are pretty darn good after all, as it turns out. I'd like to read you one. This is a story called Weeds and Wildness, and to give you a kind of a sense of what I'm after with this particular story. The title, Weeds and Wildness, I took from a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins called Inversnaid. And the closing lines of Inversnaid are, what would the world be once bereft of wet and wildness? Let them be left, the wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. And for some reason that line has always, or that canvas has always spoken to me in some kind of strange way about the celebration of the wild things of the world and of the untidy and unkempt things. And so in some way that was the inspiration for this particular story. Weeds and Wildness. Everybody knew Charlie Blankenship to be something of a loose cannon. A man you didn't want to get into an argument with at a ball game or a bar, because he never truly knew what Charlie might do. Swing a log chain, poison your dog, or drunkenly hug you and declare that you were right after all. Mark was in the same class as one of the Blankenship boys, John Wayne, and they shared a spot at the end of the bench during basketball games. So he knew Charlie a little from his occasional visits to games, where he would lean over the bench behind them and say, "You got this, boys. That bunch ain't worth shit, except that one dude. Put a couple of defensive specialists on him, and they wouldn't score 30. Defensive specialist was a charitable phrase for someone who never made the line score, except during blowouts. And Mark had always figured that Charlie's appearances were his way of letting his son know he was there, supporting him, since he wouldn't have much opportunity to cheer if he waited until they were in a game. Coach always called them salt and pepper, in lame attempt at coachly humor, since although the two were both average height and average build, Mark was pale and freckled, while John Wayne, like his father, had a thick wave of black hair, like a 50s rock and roll star, and a steady growth of facial hair that seemed entirely inappropriate for a high school student. They knew that their real resemblance was in the fact that they would never get in a game that mattered. Still, a dad hovering behind the bench was an embarrassment. John Wayne remained studiously neutral until his dad returned to the bleachers. And then the two of them would exchange a glance of hard-boiled, high school boy sympathy. So, Charlie was a character. Everybody in town knew him, but no one expected it when the ATF people swooped in and arrested him with a helicopter and a line of cars that sped through town at 4 in the morning. On the courthouse lawn, they spread out the hall for the cameras, belts of ammunition, grenades and grenade launchers, and the centerpiece of the raid, a 50 caliber machine gun that had somehow walked away from Fort Leonard Wood about a year ago. By then, it was the spring of senior year, and nobody knew what to say to John Wayne. For although the cash had been found in a locked shed at the far end of the Blankenship property, and although Charlie's lawyer insisted that things were not at all as they appeared, it was only natural to infer that John Wayne knew what was going on. But no charges were ever brought. John Wayne continued attending classes, and Charlie wound up taking a plea deal that sent him to the federal prison in Forest City, Arkansas, not too far a drive for weekend visits. Mark's dad preached at the First Baptist Church on the west edge of town, and as the pastor of a respectable church, knew that the subject was off limits. There was ample room to talk about sin and error, repentance and redemption, without getting into local matters. But Grandpa, who still lived on the old place down by the river, didn't mince words when he came in for Sunday dinner. The Blankenships have been getting more foolish with every generation, he said. Charlie is the worst of the bunch. But at least he didn't peach on his boy, and I give him credit for that. After graduation, John Wayne went into the service, as he had planned since sophomore year. But before leaving, he told everyone that he wanted to be called just Wayne from here on out. He didn't specify whether he was tired of the association with the old cowboy movie star, whether he figured out that John Wayne was the name of too many criminals to count, or whether he wanted to disassociate himself from anything his father had given him. But Wayne it was, so all the news tidbits that the Army sent home called him Wayne Blankenship. His completion of basic training, his attainment of specialist status, his marksmanship badge, his deployment overseas. Mark didn't know what to do with himself. The military had no appeal. Coach liked to berate him during practice that he lacked the killer instinct, the one quality that kept him off the starting five. "Looky there," he would say, pointing to Dwayne Jackson at the other end of the court. Excuse me. Strutting like a banny after knocking down another of his patented shots from the corner. "The only thing that separates you from him is Dwayne's got the killer instinct." Mark didn't doubt that one bit, having been punched out in the dressing room by Dwayne more times than he cared to think. And presumably Wayne was off acquiring the killer instinct, or its near relative. But Mark didn't want to have the killer instinct. He wanted to live a harmless life, an existence like a bee or a flower, a lily of the field, like in the verse Dad preached on whenever he conducted the funeral of a little old lady nobody could remember anything about. College was the other obvious option. His friends were going off to SEMO or Missouri State, but the community college or the tech school. And there were scholarships at Southwest Baptist for the children of clergy, a tidbit that his parents dropped into conversation weekly. But Mark felt worn out with quizzes and exams, required readings, the whole machinery of education that had been grinding away for the last dozen years. He wanted to stop thinking for a while, to simply live without the urgency of preparing himself for something yet to come. So he dawdled and delayed, and he missed deadlines for applying, until he had procrastinated himself into a semester of nothing. That left work. The farm and home supply was hiring, and the manager, a parishioner, took his application without a glance and told him to show up on Monday. "We'll get your name tag fixed up," he said. "Wear a clean shirt with a collar. No dirt or stains. Minimum wage for the first 6 months." "Yes, sir," Mark said. The manager paused and looked up. "You come from good people. That means a lot around here. A lot of kids, they want to shake the dust from off their feet as soon as school's over. But if you stick around, you can make a good life for yourself. 10 years ago, I came out of high school and took a job here, stocking shelves and running the register. There's a future in rural supply." "Yes, sir," Mark repeated, feeling foolish that he could think of nothing else to say. But the manager didn't appear to notice, and after they shook hands, Mark stood blinking in the sunlight outside, struck with a sudden impulse to call Grandpa. He picked up on the second ring, which probably meant that he had been napping. "I'm in the parking lot of the farm and home. Anything you need?" The pause at the other end of the line told him that Grandpa was trying to figure out his reason for calling, since Mark rarely ran errands unprompted, and Grandpa usually took care of his own tasks. Mark would have told him that he felt adrift and lonesome, that everyone was moving on ahead of him, and that he needed to be around someone who conveyed a sense of calm about the uncertain future ahead. But they were not people who spoke of such things, although Mark imagined that Grandpa could sense it. "Maybe. How much you want for a roll of woven wire?" "I'll go check." He kept the call open as he walked to the side of the building where the large items were stacked. $150. That's about right. But Grandpa didn't ask for a roll, since they both knew that Mark wouldn't have that kind of money in his pocket or anywhere else. "If you can wait a week, I'll get you the employee discount." "Is that right? You're going to work there? Come on out and tell me about it." That was the invitation Mark had been angling for. He checked himself in the rearview mirror, for Grandpa did not approve of disheveled young people, and headed down the county road toward the river. Grandpa still lived on his old place, the home place as Dad called it, although it was really time for him to move to town. He didn't farm anymore, but rented out the pasture to the neighbors, took care of the haying and the fences. So he puttered around the house and barn, and he worked as a caretaker at the nature camp up the road, run by a charity from St. Louis that brought kids down to experience the outdoors. The nature camp consisted of a cluster of cabins a few hundred yards down from where the steel truss bridge crossed the river, a fine old barn where they kept their horses and tack, and a big stone assembly hall, supposedly over 100 years old, that they used for meals and evening programs. Grandpa kept their buses running and their pathways mowed, and in the off-season he served as an unofficial security guard, shooing away teenagers and calling the sheriff on more significant intruders. As a boy, Mark occasionally rode over to it with his grandfather, and he was always struck to see how they greeted him with casual friendliness and childish enthusiasm. The staffers waving with, "Hiya," and the campers dashing over to filch Jolly Ranchers out of his pocket as he patted their heads. To Mark, Grandpa had always been loved, but a little scary. A man with neatly combed gray hair and black-rimmed eyeglasses who looked like the picture of Barry Goldwater in his history book. Someone who stood at the peak of deference and respect. But to these people, he was a kindly old man with a toolbox, one of the locals, and nothing more. He was a different person to them, someone inconsequential. And strangest of all, he didn't seem to mind. He'd caught Mark's eye once as he filled his pockets with the candies he kept in a canister on top of the refrigerator. "Those kids don't have the advantages we do," he said. "I always like to give them a little sport." Grandpa sat on the front porch waiting for him, 2 glasses of iced tea on the table, as he pulled in the lane. "There's the working man," he said. Mark took the other porch chair beside him. "Your mom and dad were hoping you'd pull the trigger at the last minute, sign up for college," Grandpa said. "Even some classes up at Flat River." "I just didn't feel ready. Maybe in January." There's many an honorable thing a man can do without a college degree, and just as many dishonorable things to do with one. I only made it out of high school through the charity of a couple of teachers. You do what you think is right. Mark sipped his tea, feeling inward relief. Everyone else had been free with their opinions on what he should do with the rest of his life, and he was happy not to have to go through it one more time. "I want to ask your help on something, now that you're going to be around here for a while," Grandpa said. "Sure. I can't do some of the work at the nature camp anymore, or if I do it, I have to spend the next day resting up. I thought maybe you could help me out a little." "Of course." "Thanks. Let's run up there and look things over." "Perfect timing. They're between sessions, so no kids around. I already told the director I'd be asking you for help." Grandpa kept an old golf cart in the driveway for short runs, so they climbed in and hummed up the road to the nature camp, through the elaborate gate, and past the main office where the director waved from the door. "My grandson," he shouted over the whir of the electric motor as they rode through the double row of cabins to the assembly hall, which stood on a slope above the rest of the camp, halfway to the edge of the woods. Behind the assembly hall stood a nondescript shed. "This is where I keep my equipment," Grandpa said, stopping the cart and climbing out. "I'll get you a key." From this high spot, they could see all the way down the valley, the residential cabins, the archery and rifle range against the hillside, the craft and nature cabins halfway between. Farther south, the pool, tennis courts, and the horse barn. And beyond it in the distance, Grandpa's place. The county road glistened black in the sunshine, its asphalt starting to soften. And across the road they could see the river, where the children were not allowed to swim, even if they wanted to. Too many hidden hazards beneath the surface, roots and rocks waiting to rear up into a lawsuit. Across the river, he knew but could not see, was Charlie Blankenship's place, a couple of miles up the road, at the end of a long rutted lane that he never graded, using poor maintenance as a tool for privacy. Mark had never seen the valley from this vantage before. It's like a little town all its own, he murmured. So it is, Grandpa said. It used to be one, too. And there was a whole settlement here in the old days, post office and everything. What happened to it? What happens to all human beings? One generation passeth the way, and another generation cometh. He pointed up the hill behind them to a little graveyard at the edge of the woods, with a chain link fence around it. Nobody ever comes to visit that place anymore, but I like to keep it cleaned up, just because. Unlike Dad, Grandpa didn't pause to sermonize. That's one thing I want you to do, run the weed eater. I do fine on the riding mower, but after a day trimming weeds, I'm about busted. His gesture took in the whole operation. Start up here at the cemetery and work down. Don't go to the horse barn, though. The horse people like to do things their own way, and they get huffy if you mess with their business. Mark had a hard time imagining himself running the trimmer for an entire day, but knew you'd have to if you wanted to keep up with his grandfather. He was a man of the older generation for whom the only choices were to work until the job was done or work until you keeled over. All right, he said, no trimming down by the horse barn. Grandpa pointed to the residential cabins. Some of those need a new coat of paint. I've been meaning to get to them, but I don't trust myself on the ladder nowadays. Maybe you can do the high and I can do the low. Mark began to regret agreeing to this task without asking what it was. No going back now. I'm going to have to work this around my schedule at the farm and home, you know. Oh, sure. No timetable on any of this. Let's go down and say hello to Max. Max, the camp director, was in his 30s, slender and balding, with plaid shorts and a polo shirt that had some designer's name on it. They shook hands. What's this I heard about a big bust over the river a while back? He asked Grandpa. Neo-Nazis across the bridge? Grandpa snorted. Not hardly. He glanced at Mark. We knew the family. The only thing Charlie Blankenship believes in is more money for Charlie Blankenship. I've had to chase him away from here a couple of times. You have? Mark said. Yet, I never mentioned it because I know you're friends with the boy. I didn't want to color your opinion. It didn't seem right. Nothing ever turned up missing. Well, that's good, I guess. Grandpa's definitions of right and wrong were clear, to himself at least, although Mark couldn't always discern them. A few more friendly words, and all was settled. Mark would come by on his off days to pitch in, keeping his own time card for $10 an hour in cash. They shook on the deal. That's the way we handle it out here in the country, right? Max said, pleased with himself. And Mark began his second career as part-time caretaker at the nature camp, his grandpa's assistant. It was a pleasant enough life, customer service at the farm and home, loading sacks of mulch into customers' cars and sweeping up spills. Soon enough, he was running the register during some shifts, a sign of growing trust. He kept his room in the basement of his parents' house, and every week he put $100 on the kitchen counter for groceries and rent, although his parents never asked for it. The action just seemed proper somehow. There was a girl named Missy from Mark Warren, just a year older, who worked at the farm and home. She was friendly and encouraging, though a little shy, which suited Mark fine. He had never been confident around girls. By the end of summer, they were going out, and at her house in October, with her parents off to Cape Girardeau for a day at the mall, they had clumsy, careful sex in her bedroom, stuffed animals watching from a high shelf. It wasn't mad passion, but it felt good, and afterward they lay together, enjoying the novelty of being naked with another person. The cash from the nature camp accumulated little by little, though it dwindled in the fall and winter as the operation closed down. But Mark still drove out to Grandpa's once a week, and they checked the empty compound for weather damage and animal incursions. With the horses gone, they could wander the empty barn, nested snugly into the hillside, with its 6-inch timbers and a family of raccoons living in the loft. This barn will outlast my house if they can keep a good roof on it, Grandpa mused. This thought seemed to spark other thoughts, and as they rode the golf cart home, he asked Mark to stay a bit. They sat on the couch and unwrapped their Jolly Ranchers. I expect you've been hearing from everybody and his dog about what you should do next, Grandpa said, especially since I hear you have a girlfriend now. Mark shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with where this was headed. Grandpa was a godly man, and although not a preacher himself, had raised one, so his thoughts on morality were clear. Mark and Missy had been finding private spots almost weekly these days, and Mark guessed that word was getting around. But Grandpa's thoughts were tending in a different direction. You don't remember your grandmother, but this was her dad's farm. He had bought it back in the days when you could actually make a living on a farm. His people were from Boulder County, but he was one of 5 boys, so they had to find their own places. When he couldn't keep it up any longer, I took over. I thought maybe your daddy would take over for me someday, but he got the call, which is fine. And as a pastor, he needs to live in town. A man has to do what's best for himself and his family. They heard the sound of a truck passing on the county road, and both craned their necks to see who it was. Grandpa continued, "So when the time comes for me to move off the farm, I'll have some choices to make." He leaned forward and tapped the glass top of the coffee table as if laying out cards. "I could sell it locally, although I doubt if anybody local could meet my price. I could sell it out of local. That's this close to the river, somebody would probably want to make a resort out of it, or one of them B&Bs. Or I could let you live in it rent-free. Maybe just transfer you the deed so that the government couldn't come after it if I end up in the nursing home." He stood up. "That's why I wanted to tell you. Think it over and talk with your folks. The point is, we are people with roots. You can't make a living farming on a patch of ground this size anymore, but it's a solid house with good water. Not everybody wants to live way out here in the woods, and I understand that. You have to get your internet off the dish. People tell me it only works about half the time." He held the door open for Mark. "No rush. I don't plan to die anytime soon." But of course, there was a rush. One generation passeth, and another generation cometh. Time's winged chariot, as Mr. Seltzer had told them in English class. reading a poem that he didn't go into very deeply, because they all figured out that it was really about sex. Just last week, they had gone to the funeral of another one of Grandpa's buddies, who had gone to the doctor for a checkup and come out with a death sentence. And the others who had fallen off their tractors, or had the tractors fall on them, or had gone foggy with the worst killer of all, the one they dreaded the most and hardly dared even to speak about. Mark had never thought of himself as a person with roots. He was just a guy, as far as he had ever considered it, with the usual loyalties to family and school. Roots seemed more mysterious, something for people with family crests, and it made him think of the ladies from the Historical Society who always set up a booth at the county fair. But he liked the idea of a place of his own, a place to entertain friends, one that even had a river frontage and its own modest landmark, a big flat rock that jutted out into the current. He had fished with Grandpa off that rock 100 times as a kid and used it as a landing for the john boat they gigged from in the wintertime. For the rest of the winter he mused about it, and as he restocked shelves in the farm at home, he watched Missy from a distance, ringing up customers with a blank expression until someone she knew came through the line. Missy was all right. They had good times. But once he had a place of his own, the weight of it all would begin to gather. Missy had already made the old remark about getting the milk and buying the cow. The longer he hung around, the closer he came to the moment when continuing to hang around became his only option. And then, in the early spring, Charlie Blankenship wandered into the store. Charlie Blankenship, of all people, as if nothing had happened, thicker and darker than Mark remembered, with a gray cast to his complexion, as if he had been stored underground somewhere, which Mark supposed was not far from true. Mark slipped behind the swinging doors to the back storage area. He didn't want to talk to Charlie, and actually felt a little afraid, for he was a man who had been to prison, and heaven only knows what he had been through. Mark watched through the window as Charlie roamed the aisles. The manager tried to discreetly follow him around, clumsily obvious as he pushed the restocking cart from aisle to aisle. Charlie took a deliberately roundabout path through the store, feigning interest in motor oil and humorous greeting cards before placing each item carefully back on the shelf. The charade went on so long that Mark finally came out of the back room. "Hi, Mr. Blankenship," he said. "Anything I can help you with?" "Well, looky there. Are you working here now?" Apparently he wanted an accidental meeting, so Mark played along. "Yes, sir. Here since summer." Charlie gave off an aroma that Mark thought might be stale alcohol. "Big changes all around," he said. "John Wayne into the Army, you into the working world, and me," he grinned. "I guess everybody remembers." "Yes, sir, I guess so." "You hear much out of John Wayne?" "Not a whole lot, Mr. Blankenship. Facebook message now and then." Wayne Blankenship's Facebook posts were usually gifs of people falling into swimming pools or running into electric fences. And Mark couldn't remember actually getting a message from him that wasn't likely a hacker's work. But he decided that the bare truth was unnecessary at this moment. "Yeah, neither one of us has much to communicate. It didn't let us use computers in the pen, so I lost track. Letter once in a while." Charlie straightened himself and looked around. "Well, I don't want to keep you. Just came in to browse." Then he seized him by the bicep with a painful grip. "Listen, I have a message I need to get to Wayne. Can you help me? He released his hold after an instant, but Mark got the point. Of course. Good. Come out to my place tonight, 11 or later. Then he was out the door, and Mark was left with the feeling that he'd been maneuvered into something. But he didn't know what. Nothing to do but follow through. He waited till 11, then left his basement bedroom quietly. He went out through the garage to his truck, parked in the driveway, and drove out of town. In the night, he watched for deer and possums, armadillos, raccoons. Blankenship stood in his front yard, a beer in hand, as Mark pulled up. "Hi, Mr. Blankenship," Mark said, climbing out of his truck. Charlie made a world-encompassing gesture with his beer. He didn't move to go inside. "Take a look around. I'm clearing out tomorrow. The marshals are seizing the property and gave me a day to pack up my shit." "Can they do that?" Charlie shrugged. "Asset forfeiture, name of the game these days. I kind of hate it. Property's been in my family a long time. But the house is getting pretty crappy. I expect they'll just doze it and auction the acreage." There was a stock trailer hooked up to Charlie's pickup, half loaded with household goods. "I guess I better let you get back to it," Mark said. "What's the message for John Wayne?" "Not so fast." Charlie looked him over. "This is a delicate situation." He set the beer on the fender of the trailer and walked closer. "It's not so much a message as a thing. Let's drive and I'll explain on the way." He climbed into the passenger side of Mark's truck and waved him in. Mark's stomach sank as he picked his way down Blankenship's Lane to the county road. Charlie sat in silence until they reached the junction. "Left," he said. "Cross the bridge and then stop." The trip to the bridge took only a minute, but to Mark it felt like an hour as Charlie remained silent. What had happened to him in prison? Mark didn't remember him as this abrupt, alarming figure, someone who exuded a veiled sense of menace by his simple presence. Or maybe it was all in his anxious mind. They reached the bridge, crossed it, and stopped. "Now, switch off your lights and creep along," Charlie said. "When you get to the nature camp gate, turn in." "Mr. Blankenship, I'm not so sure about this," Mark said, his voice wobbly. "These are good people I deal with." "Relax, I ain't gonna take anything. I'm on parole, son." "Grandpa says he used to have to run you off from there." Charlie snorted. "Maybe twice out of the 30 or 40 times I've been in there. But I never took a thing from them. Never took so much as a pool noodle, even though they left them laying around all the time. Don't shit in your own nest. That's a thief's first rule." By now they had reached the entry gate. Mark stopped his truck. "Drive down as close as you can to the archery range without leaving tracks," Charlie said. Mark couldn't think of anything to do except what he was told. He climbed out, unlocked the gate, and drove through. It was a warm enough night for peep frogs, but cool enough to feel a shiver as they stepped out at the archery range. They reached the end of the path. Charlie took a small black flashlight out of his back pocket and switched it on. They walked around the shooting stand to the straw bales stacked at the edge of the woods, where the instructors mounted targets in the summer. Charlie aimed the beam of light at the base of the leftmost stack of bales. "Here's my message for John Wayne," he said. "Over the years I've been setting a little bit aside all the time. when he maybe got married or wanted to buy a house or some shit. It's in a 2-pound Folgers can, one of those plastic ones, with duct tape around the lid. But now they're going to be watching my bank account and every other damn thing about me. Can't even send him a gift card at Christmas time. Come tomorrow, I'll be out of here with a new name, and that's the last anybody will ever hear of me. He paused. So, if he ever comes back, walk him out here and show him the spot. What he does after that is up to him. Take it, leave it, call the sheriff. Charlie walked back to the truck. Don't you want to check on it? Mark asked. He shrugged. I know what's there, and you don't need to know. As he turned the truck around and inched toward the entrance, driving more by memory than by sight, Mark realized why Charlie had gotten out of prison so fast. He had turned informer, and now his life was not his own. Tomorrow he would become someone else in a strange place, cut off forever from what he was before. Charlie Blankenship wasn't much of a figure around here, but at least he was Charlie Blankenship. But why'd you pick me? Mark said. You're the only friend of his I know of. I'm sure he's got other friends, but you're the only one I know. Charlie got out to close the gate. And besides, you're his teammate. That counts for something. Salt and pepper, right? And you'll likely be around here when he gets out of the service, if they don't blow him up over in Afghanistan or wherever. You're from around here. Mark stepped out of the truck to make sure the lock was firmly closed. And as he did, the two of them were transfixed by a beam of light from across the highway, which held steady on them for several seconds. They stared into it like the possums that Mark had dodged on his way out, glassy-eyed and captured. Then Charlie said, "Hey, Ott," and the beam of light lowered. It was Grandpa in his golf cart, his gig light plugged into the outlet, an incredulous look on his face. There they stood. Mark felt as though he was about to lose his balance, as if a sinkhole was opening under his feet between him and Grandpa. Then Grandpa broke the silence. "Well, I never," he said. He switched off his light and drove home. The darkness surrounded Mark and his ears buzzed. Charlie cleared his throat. "If you need to go explain to your grandpa what you were doing here, go ahead. He'll have a deputy here in the morning with a search warrant and a backhoe. I'll be upset and maybe headed back to the camp. But maybe not. I can't do nothing about it. I can't threaten you, so I won't even try." He turned away. "You go on. I'll walk home." He disappeared into the starlit night. Mark remained in the driveway of the nature camp a while longer, trying to figure things out. He owed nothing to Charlie Blankenship by any human measure, nor to Wayne for that matter, whom he wouldn't have called friend had Charlie not used the word. Yet he felt as though an obligation had been laid on him anyway, without his asking for it, and he didn't know how to discharge it. Grandpa would want to know what he'd been doing out there, and he deserved an answer. But Mark wasn't quite ready to give it. If all this talk of roots meant anything, surely it included Grandpa giving him a little grace time, the bit of space he needed to work his way through the layers of duty that rested on him. He climbed in his truck and headed toward town. Grandpa's house was dark, but Mark knew he was watching. He was probably sitting on the porch right now, wondering about it. And Mark could only hope that he would grant him that grace, listen to his explanation, and trust him if he decided to keep Charlie Blankenship's secret. Keep it, don't keep it. Neither felt right. He flashed his headlights as he passed the house. A salute, a signal, a plea. Although at the moment he had neither the words to express what he wanted to say, nor the thoughts he wanted to express. As he topped the final ridge before town, his scattered lights lay before him, like someone's Christmas decorations tossed in the yard still lit. He slowed to a stop and took them all in. House lights, street lights, business lights, all spread out in the valley, seemingly random but somehow connected. If only he could see the pattern. Somewhere in that tangle was the light in front of his parents' house, and the lights that patterned the parking lots around his dad's church, and the hissing yellow sodium vapor lights that surrounded the farm and home. Everything serenely illuminated, the darkness held at bay. Mark would have liked for one of those lights to be his and his alone. But for now, he would have to navigate from borrowed light to borrowed light as best he could. He put the truck in drive and headed down the hill, for it was going to be an early day tomorrow. And that's the story of